All right, welcome to the deep dive where we basically take a whole bunch of sources and try to pull out the really important stuff. The stuff you really need to get your head around some of these big, complicated topics. Think of it as like a shortcut to being in the know, but we always try to throw in some little surprises along the way. And today we're going deep on a handbook all about planning, monitoring, and evaluation.
You got it. This handbook was put together, I think, mainly with UNDP staff in mind. But you know what? A lot of what it talks about is super relevant to, well, basically anyone working in development, trying to make a difference. And the cool thing is you can actually find this handbook online. So we'll make sure to put that link in the show notes.
Perfect.
The goal here, just like always, is to get to the heart of the matter. Those aha moments, those light bulb moments, without getting lost in all the technical jargon.
Right.
So consider this your guided tour through like the fundamentals of what actually makes development work effective. Like what really works.
I love it. So this handbook, it's a joint effort, right, from different parts of UNDP.
Yep, that's right.
And we definitely want to give a shout out to the core team who spearheaded this whole thing. Asoka Kastiriarachi, Thomas Erickson, Stephen Rodrigues, and Azusa Kubota.
Absolutely. Huge thanks to them.
And of course, a big thank you to Nurul Alam for making sure it's all top-notch quality.
Yeah, he did a great job. Now, before we jump in, the first thing to know is how this handbook is meant to be used. It's not really something you'd sit down and read cover to cover like a novel or something.
Right.
It's more like a toolbox, something you can refer back to at different points in your program.
Okay.
And it's got this very specific focus, planning, monitoring, and evaluating results. And that's a big deal because that's what sets it apart from those more general guides on program or project management, the kind that cover everything.
Right.
So if you're looking for, let's say, the nitty-gritty on cost-benefit analysis or how to do an environmental impact assessment, you'd usually head over to UNDP's Program and Operations Policies and Procedures, or, the POPP, as they call it.
Gotcha. Makes sense. And I think there are also some really helpful companion pieces online, right, to go with this handbook
Yeah, there are.
that delve into more specific areas like what is it, conflict prevention, recovery,
Yeah, that's right.
and also specific guidance on outcome evaluations. I think all that can be found on the Evaluation Office website.
Exactly. Now, one of the big shifts in thinking that this handbook highlights is the move from what used to be called results-based management, or RBM, to managing for development results, MfDR.
Okay.
It might sound like they just changed a few words around, but it actually signals a pretty significant shift in perspective.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what's the core difference here that we really need to understand?
Well, see, the traditional RBM, it tended to focus a lot on like the organization's internal results, like their own performance, Are we hitting our targets? Are we doing what we said we would? Stuff like that. MfDR, on the other hand, it takes those same RBM principles, the planning, the monitoring, the evaluation, the learning, but it really puts the emphasis on, are we actually seeing real change in people's lives?
Right.
And in the environment, like the actual conditions in the countries where these programs are happening.
Okay.
So it's not just about ticking boxes and saying, yep, we did what we said we would. It's about looking at the bigger picture and asking, is this actually making a real difference in the world?
That makes a lot of sense. So it's really about making sure that the focus stays on creating that tangible, positive change out there in the real world.
Exactly. That's the key.
And this is where good planning, monitoring, and evaluation becomes so important, right?
Exactly. The handbook makes the argument that these three elements are like non-negotiable. They're absolutely essential if you want to make development programs more effective. Good planning helps you zero in on what actually matters, the real results you're trying to achieve. Then the monitoring and evaluation part, that gives you the tools to learn from what you're doing, both the good stuff and the not so good stuff.
Right.
And that learning, in turn, helps you make better decisions down the line, which, ideally leads to better outcomes for people.
So let's dive into those core concepts one by one. Let's start with planning. How does the handbook define planning in this particular context?
Well, according to the handbook, planning is all about, first off, setting your goals. Where do you want to end up? Then you got to figure out the best strategies to get there.
Right.
Once you've got your strategies, you need to outline exactly how you're going to put them into action, like a step-by-step guide, basically.
Oh, okay.
And then, of course, making sure you've got the resources you need to make it all happen, whether that's money, people, or whatever.
Right.
But here's the crucial part, and the handbook really stresses this. Right from the start, you also got to set up how you're going to track your progress and measure your success.
Okay.
You know that saying, failing to plans is planning to fail?
Yeah.
Well, the handbook really drives that point home. It's like, if you don't have that clear blueprint, that roadmap for what you want to achieve, you're basically setting yourself up for, well, failure.
And then we have evaluation. Now, how is that different from monitoring in this context?
Evaluation, that's like taking a really good, hard look at your activities. Could be things that have already finished or things that are still ongoing. The goal is to figure out, okay, are they actually meeting the goals they set out to achieve? And are they helping to, guide future decisions?
Okay.
The main difference between evaluation and monitoring is that evaluations are designed to be independent, like an outsider's perspective.
Right.
It's like having someone come in and give you an honest assessment of whether you're on the right track without any bias. They tend to be more in-depth, using a bunch of different methods and really analyzing the data. But at the end of the day, both monitoring and evaluation have the same goal: to give you the information you need to make better decisions and improve what you're doing.
It's like checking your map to make sure you're headed in the right direction and, maybe adjusting your course if you need to.
Exactly. Now, the handbook also links RBM to some other really important ideas: learning, managing risk, and being accountable. Can you tell us a bit more about how those fit into the whole picture?
Yeah, definitely. It seems like all these things are like super interconnected, right?
Absolutely.
Learning from what we do, both the successes and the not so successful stuff. It's not just about tweaking our current projects. It's actually about helping everyone involved get better at making decisions in the future. And ultimately, designing programs that are more likely to have a real impact because, let's face it, no matter how good your plan is at the start, things almost never go exactly according to plan, right?
That's so true.
There are always surprises, unexpected challenges, and sometimes even opportunities that pop up along the way.
Exactly. And that's where managing risk comes in. The handbook points out that development work, by its very nature, it's full of uncertainties.
Right.
There are always potential problems lurking around the corner, but also, sometimes unexpected opportunities emerge. Good RBM systems, they should help us spot these risks and opportunities early on so we can, minimize the risks and grab those opportunities when they come up.
And accountability, that's the final piece of this puzzle, right?
Absolutely. Accountability is huge. It's like the cornerstone of all this. RBM helps us be accountable to a whole bunch of different stakeholders, the governors we're working with, the people we're trying to help, the organizations giving us funding, other partner organizations, and even the UNDP Executive Board. It's about making sure we're being responsible, both with the resources we've been given and for achieving the results we said we would achieve. In fact, the handbook actually gives this really neat summary of what RBM helps managers and staff do: better manage risks and opportunities, be accountable and responsible, make informed decisions, take those corrective actions to improve, and learn from what's been done.
One thing that really stood out to me in the intro was how much they emphasize getting stakeholders involved. Why is that considered so important throughout the whole process?
Oh, that's a great question. The handbook really hammers home the point that engaging stakeholders at every single stage, from the initial brainstorming and planning all the way through to the monitoring, the evaluation, the learning, it's not just a good idea, it's absolutely crucial.
Okay.
And the reason for that is it helps build buy-in. It helps people feel like they're actually part of this thing, like they have ownership over it.
Right.
And the idea is to move away from those situations where only a tiny group of people feel responsible for the outcomes. We're seeing a growing trend in development work towards, things like gender equality and making sure that these programs are actually owned by the people and communities they're meant to benefit.
Right.
And the evidence is pretty clear on this. When people feel like they have a stake in something, when they feel that sense of, hey, this is ours, we tend to see much better, more sustainable results.
Right.
There's more pride, there's more willingness to keep things going in the long run, and people are just more actively involved.
Makes sense.
The takeaway here is that genuine ownership, it's not just about asking for feedback after the fact.
Right.
It's about actually shaping the whole process together with the people who are going to be most affected by it, even if they're not the loudest voices in the room.
And are there any core principles that guide how the handbook suggests we approach this whole thing?
Yeah, there are a few really important ones that kind of run through the whole framework. First, there's this strong emphasis on promoting national capacity development. This means we should always be asking ourselves, is this going to do sustainable in the long term?
Right.
Can we build on what's already there, the existing systems within the country? What skills and knowledge do people in the country already have? And can our monitoring and evaluation actually help to strengthen the national M&E systems? That focus on sustainability, that's really key if you want to see lasting impact.
Definitely. What's the next big principle?
The second one that really stands out is promoting inclusiveness, gender equality, and the empowerment of women. And this means making sure that men, women, and groups that have traditionally been marginalized, they're all actively involved in everything we do, from the planning stages all the way through to the evaluation.
Right.
Without asking some tough questions. Does our understanding of the problem actually reflect the needs of everyone? And do we have the data broken down by gender and other relevant factors to really track our progress and see if we're making a difference for everyone?
Okay.
The handbook also briefly mentions how important it is to be aware of and sensitive to any potential crises or conflicts that might be happening in the area where we're working,
Right.
just to make sure our programs don't accidentally make things worse.
Makes sense. Finally, the intro touches on the roles that different parts of UNDP and its governing board play in all of this.
Yeah, so the regional bureau within UNDP, they have this important oversight role, especially when it comes to the evaluations that country offices carry out.
Okay.
They kind of keep an eye on things, making sure the quality is good and that the planning, monitoring, and evaluation processes are being followed properly.
Right.
Then you have UNDP management itself, which is crucial for, creating that culture within the organization that really values results-based management.
Right.
They're the ones making sure the planning is solid, that the monitoring actually happens, and that the lessons we learned from those evaluations, both internal and external, are actually put into practice.
Okay.
And then at the highest level, you have the UNDP Executive Board.
Right.
They're the ones who shape the overall direction of UNDP, reviewing those big reports on performance and evaluations, and providing guidance for future planning.
It's interesting how it all kind of connects, like from the big picture stuff all the way down to the nitty-gritty of individual projects.
Exactly. And remember those high-level blueprints we talked about? The UNDF, which is the UN's overall strategy in a country, and the CPD, which is UNDP's specific plan within that framework. Well, monitoring needs to be aligned with those broader goals.
Okay, that gives us a really good foundation. Now let's get into the main discussion, starting with planning for results. The handbook mentions some key things that should come out of this planning process.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're doing this planning for results thing effectively, the handbook points to several key deliverables. These include like a super thorough analysis of all the stakeholders involved, a crystal clear understanding of the problems you're trying to solve, a really compelling vision of what success looks like, a sort of visual map of how you'll get there, they call it the results map, and then finally the detailed results framework that'll guide your monitoring and evaluation.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Let's start with the stakeholder analysis. What exactly does that involve?
Stakeholder analysis is all about figuring out who all the players are in this game. Identifying and understanding all the different individuals, groups, and organizations that have a stake in what you're doing or who could potentially influence how things turn out. And this isn't just about governments and other UN agencies. It's also about the people you're aiming to help and even bodies like the UNDP Executive Board. They all have a role to play.
Right, right.
And the handbook suggests using some helpful tools like this thing called an importance and influence matrix.
Okay.
It's a way to visually map out who your stakeholders are and how much influence they have, so you can figure out the best way to work with each one.
Can you give us some concrete examples of the kinds of stakeholders we might be talking about here?
Sure. So depending on what you're working on and where you're working, your stakeholders could include, let's see, the main political parties, religious organizations, NGOs, both the ones who support you and the ones who might be critical, private sector companies, representatives from minority groups, youth organizations, maybe even the official body that's in charge of elections if you're working on something related to that.
Right, right.
And then you might have international observer groups, community-based organizations, women's groups, and even, those informal community leaders who have a lot of influence on the ground.
I see.
And for each of these stakeholders, it's really important to think about, okay, are they likely to be supportive of our work, or are they potentially going to be a roadblock?
And the handbook actually brings up a really interesting point about certain stakeholders that are often overlooked in the planning stage.
Yes, this is crucial. Sometimes, especially when you're dealing with complex programs, the voices of marginalized groups, like poor rural communities, minorities, and other groups that are often excluded, they don't always get heard.
Right.
It's easy to assume that these groups, maybe they don't have the information or the education to contribute in a meaningful way.
Right, right.
But the handbook is like, whoa, hold on a second. It cautions against this kind of thinking, saying that this oversight can actually be super costly in the long run. Because these groups, the ones that are often excluded, they can offer incredibly valuable perspectives that you might miss otherwise.
So it's about making sure that we're actually hearing from everyone who might be affected, not just the people who are already at the table, so to speak.
Exactly. A good planner should always be asking, whose voice is missing from this conversation?
So once we've mapped out all our stakeholders, what's the next step in this planning process?
Okay, so the next step, and this is often done through workshops or a series of meetings, is to really nail down the main problems we want to tackle.
Okay.
And the handbook makes a really important point here. When you're defining these problems, it's better to frame them as negative conditions or situations, rather than focusing on the absence of specific solutions.
Okay, I think I see what you mean.
Like instead of saying minorities don't have the right to vote, it's more helpful to say there are low levels of participation by minorities in elections.
Right, right. It's a more nuanced way of looking at it.
Exactly. This framing encourages you to think more broadly about all the different factors that might be contributing to the problem, and it helps you avoid jumping to conclusions about what the solution should be.
And how do we decide which of these problems we've identified to focus on first? Like, which ones should be our top priority?
The handbook has this really useful way of thinking about this, using three key criteria. First, how much of a national priority is this problem?
Okay.
Second, how much support do we have from other partners to address it?
Right.
And third, what's UNDP's own capacity and what unique value can we bring to this particular area? They call it the just do it zone.
Okay, tell me more about this just do it zone.
So imagine you've got a problem that scores high on all three of those criteria. It's a top priority for the country, other organizations are on board and ready to work with us, and UNDP has the skills and resources to really make a difference.
Right.
That's your just do it zone. Those are the problems you should focus on first. This model also helps you figure out where you might need to do more advocacy work to build support for an issue, or where UNDP might have the expertise, but the issue isn't a top national priority right now. It's a really practical way to prioritize your efforts.
The outline also mentions something called problem tree analysis. What is that all about?
So problem tree analysis, it's basically a technique that helps you get to the root of a problem. It's like, digging down to find out what's really causing it.
Okay.
You start with the main problem, which is like the trunk of your tree, and then you branch out to identify the causes, which are like the roots feeding the problem, and the effects, which are like the branches growing out of it. This visual way of looking at the problem helps everyone understand how different issues are connected, and it's super useful for figuring out the best places to intervene.
So it's about going beyond just treating the symptoms and actually addressing the underlying causes.
Exactly. Imagine trying to fix a leaky roof by just slapping a bandage on the ceiling. Problem tree analysis is like, okay, let's figure out where that leak is actually coming from. Is it cracked tiles? Is it poor drainage?
Right, right. Get to the root of the problem.
Exactly, because addressing that root cause, that's where you're going to see real, lasting change.
Okay, so once we've really analyzed the problems, we need to have a vision for what the future should look like, right?
Exactly. The vision statement, that's where you paint a picture of what success looks like. It's a clear and realistic picture of how things will be better in the future, typically looking ahead 5 to 10 years if everything goes according to plan. Stakeholders should really think about, okay, how will this region, this society, or this community be better off if we achieve what we set out to achieve? Good guiding questions to ask are, if we knock this out of the park, what will things look like 5 years from now? And what concrete changes will have happened on the ground? And the vision, it should be stated in a positive way, focusing on what we want to achieve rather than what we want to avoid.
So we've got our problem analysis, we've got our vision, and that leads us to develop what's called a results map.
Yeah, exactly. Developing the results map is a really important step. It's basically taking those problems we identified earlier and flipping them around, rephrasing them as positive results, like the opposite of the problem. Then it maps out all the things that need to be in place, the prerequisites, to achieve those results. This involves thinking about not just what UNDP can do, but what all the other partners involved can contribute, and even factors that might be outside everyone's direct control. The results map, it kind of shows you those different layers of results, from those immediate outputs to the longer-term impacts, and it helps you see the bigger picture beyond just individual projects. It also helps make those underlying assumptions more visible, the things we're assuming will be true in order for our plan to work.
And assumptions are those conditions that need to be true for our planned actions to actually lead to the results we're hoping for, right?
You got it. For example, if we think that increasing public trust in the government will lead to more people voting, we might be assuming that the political environment will be stable, a place where people feel safe going out to vote. The handbook is like, hey, don't just assume these things will happen, spell them out. Because clearly stating these assumptions actually makes your program design stronger, and it can help you identify potential risks that could throw a wrench in your plans. So make note of those risks right alongside those assumptions at each level of the results map.
It's like identifying those potential potholes in the row ahead of time so you can try to avoid them.
Exactly. Now, all of this is building up to what we call the results framework. This is where it all comes together.
So what exactly is the results framework, and how does it tie all of this together?
The results framework, it's like the backbone of your whole plan. It lays out the different levels of results you're aiming for, typically in this hierarchy with 4 levels. Impacts, which are the long-term big picture changes you're hoping to contribute to. Outcomes, which are those more medium-term changes that your programs and your partners' programs are all working towards. Outputs, which are the specific products or services that your projects will deliver. And then activities, which are those concrete actions you'll take to produce those outputs. And the results framework, it shows those connections between all these different levels. It's like, okay, these activities lead to these outputs, which contribute to these outcomes, which ultimately help us achieve those big picture impacts.
So it's like a roadmap that tells you what you're trying to achieve at each step of the way and how you'll know if you're on the right track.
Exactly. The handbook also mentions something called SMART criteria when you're talking about outcomes and outputs. Have you heard of SMART criteria?
I think I have, but remind me what it stands for.
SMART. This is a really handy acronym that helps you make sure your outcomes and outputs are well-defined and achievable. It stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Okay, that rings a bell.
For example, instead of having a vague outcome like improve education, a SMART outcome would be something like increase the literacy rate of girls aged 10 to 12 in District X by 15% by the end of 2025.
Okay, I see how that's much more specific and measurable.
Right, it tells you exactly who you're targeting, what you're trying to achieve, by how much, by when, and it's clearly connected to that broader goal of improving education. And outputs should be smart too. Instead of just saying conduct training, a smart output might be conduct 3 5-day training workshops for 30 teachers on new literacy techniques by June 2024.
Okay, so we've planned out our results. Now, how do we actually monitor our progress to see if we're on track to achieve those results?
All right, so the handbook really emphasizes that you can't just think about monitoring as something you do after the planning is done. Planning for monitoring needs to go hand in hand with thinking about evaluation from the very beginning.
Okay.
Having that clear results model, that results framework we just talked about right from the start, that's super crucial for what they call evaluability.
Evaluability.
It basically means how easy it is to actually measure your progress and evaluate whether you're achieving what you set out to achieve. And this brings us to the concept of a monitoring and evaluation framework, or M&E framework for short.
So what exactly is this M&E framework?
Think of it like your detailed plan for keeping tabs on how things are going and figuring out whether you're actually making a difference. It spells out exactly what you'll be monitoring and evaluating, what specific activities you need to do to make that happen, who's responsible for each of those activities, when they'll take place, what methods you'll use, and what resources you'll need, both financial and human. And it's also important to think about any potential risks or assumptions that might mess with your ability to monitor and evaluate effectively. Those unexpected things that could pop up along the way.
Of course, resources are going to be key for all of this. Does the handbook talk about how much money and staff time you need to allocate for M&E?
Oh, absolutely. The handbook actually stresses that not having enough resources is one of the most common reasons why monitoring and evaluation end up being poorly done. So it's really important to set aside enough money and staff time for M&E right at the beginning during the planning stage.
Right.
Don't think of these costs as something extra. Think of them as an essential part of achieving your goals.
Okay.
The handbook even goes so far as to suggest having specific budget lines for monitoring and evaluation within each project, and this should be agreed upon with all your partners right from the start.
So that you don't run out of money for these crucial activities later on when it's too late.
Exactly, especially towards the end of a project, when those big evaluations often take place. Now, what are the main purposes of monitoring, according to the handbook?
Yeah, what are we actually trying to achieve with all this monitoring?
Well, monitoring serves a bunch of really important purposes. First and foremost, it allows you to track your progress. Are you actually moving towards those targets you set? It also helps you identify any bottlenecks or challenges that might be slowing you down so you can address them early on.
Right.
Monitoring also gives you the information you need to make smart decisions and to be accountable to all your stakeholders. It helps you spot those lessons learned and good practices that you can apply to other projects, and it's essential for making sure you're paying attention to things like gender equality and the needs of marginalized groups. And then, on top of all that, monitoring can help you see where your partners might need extra support, in terms of capacity development. And it gives you the evidence you need for all those regular reports and for trying to influence broader policies and decisions.
We talked earlier about how crucial it is to get stakeholders involved in the planning. Is that also important when it comes to monitoring and evaluation?
Oh, absolutely. It's just as important, if not more so.
Okay.
The handbook is like, don't leave your stakeholders out of the loop when it comes to monitoring and evaluation.
Right.
Because involving them in both of these processes brings a ton of benefits. It improves communication and understanding. It gives you better access to the people you're trying to reach. It can even help you get more resources. And it helps ensure that those lessons you learn actually get used to make things better. In UNDP-supported programs, national partners share the responsibility with UNDP for doing those planned M&E activities.
That makes sense. And the handbook also talks about the importance of aligning our M&E efforts with any existing national M&E systems, right?
Yeah, that's a big one. It goes back to that core principle of national ownership and using country systems whenever you can.
Right.
When you align your monitoring and evaluation with those existing national systems and you help to build national capacity in that area, it's not just about making your own work more sustainable in the long run, it's also about strengthening those national systems themselves.
It's like a win-win.
Exactly. And that initial planning phase, that gives you a chance to really understand what data sources already exist, what the quality of that data is like, and to identify any areas where you might be able to support further capacity development within your national partner organizations, if they request it and if it aligns with your goals.
So let's get down to the nuts and bolts of monitoring. What are the key reference points we use when we're actually doing the monitoring?
Okay, so your main reference point is going to be that M&E framework we talked about earlier.
Right.
Within that framework, you'll find the results frameworks from your planning documents at different levels. You've got the UNDGAF, the CPD, and individual project documents.
Right.
And these provide all those details about what you need to be monitoring.
Okay.
These frameworks outline, the results you're aiming for at the national, regional, and global levels, the specific outcomes that UNDP is supporting at the country level, and the outputs that are linked to each of those outcomes. They also include those key indicators, the baseline data you're starting from, and those targets you're trying to hit.
So monitoring doesn't just happen at the project level, it happens at different levels.
You got it. While a lot of the detailed monitoring happens at the project and output level, because that's where the action is, that's where you're carrying out those activities and producing the outputs that contribute to those higher level outcomes. It's also happening at those higher levels, national, program, and outcome levels. It's important to remember that while outputs and outcomes are part of that results chain, projects and programs are essentially the mechanisms we use to manage the delivery of those outputs and ultimately achieve those outcomes.
So it's like a multi-layered system where the monitoring at each level is informing the monitoring at the other levels.
Exactly. And UNDP is monitoring all of those interconnected elements.
And who's actually responsible for carrying out the monitoring at those different levels?
At the project or output level, it's usually the project manager who's got the main responsibility for the day-to-day monitoring. But when you move up to the outcome and those higher result levels, monitoring becomes more of a team effort. National authorities play a crucial role in leading and overseeing national programs, figuring out those key partnerships, and making sure the evidence gathered through monitoring is good quality and actually gets used to make decisions. UNDP management is there to make sure the monitoring is happening as planned and that the information gathered is actually being used to improve how programs are implemented. Outcome groups, which bring together all those partners working towards a common outcome, also have that shared responsibility for monitoring progress. Ultimately, successful monitoring and the achievement of those big results, it all comes down to everyone understanding their role and working together effectively.
That makes sense. The handbook also briefly mentions monitoring in crisis situations, which seems like it would be quite different. Are there specific things we need to keep in mind in those contexts?
Oh, absolutely. Your standard monitoring approaches often need to be adapted pretty significantly when you're working in those crisis situations. There are unique challenges you have to consider.
Right.
In those contexts, your M&E frameworks, they should specifically include measures that are conflict sensitive.
Okay.
What does that mean? It means